if I'm fading out, just let me know.
Oh, welcome back to Around the World with Dane Waters. Sorry, this is a global show, and as a global show, sometimes we have technical difficulties. That's just the reality of it. So, because we have guests from all over the world, it's what's called Around the World with Dane Waters. And so sometimes we have to spend time trying to work out technical difficulties. But anyway, honored to be here today with Ambassador Frank Baker from the UK. Shall I call you Ambassador? Can I call you Ambassador Frank?
No, just call me Frank.
Oh, Frank. Well, you got to, okay, Frank. You got to move back a little. I can't hear you. So there you go.
Is that any better?
No, it's not a little bit.
Wait a
Try to
minute,
move.
let's try here. Is that any better?
There you go. Perfect. Right there.
Okay, right. I
There,
won't move.
there
I
you go.
won't
Don't
move.
move. I love having the power I have to tell an ambassador not to move. I love it. It's just. So, Frank, thanks for being with me today. We have a very serious topic: Middle East, war in Iran. Your
Yeah.
background. You worked in Iraq and Kuwait, and you know the Middle East better than anybody I know. So first, let me get your impression about this war. And do you think it was necessary? Let's start there. Do you think this war was necessary?
I think the problem we have, Dave, is these days, and I'm sure you're different, but I find as I talk to a lot of people about this, that very few people have any sense of history and any sense of strategy. Um, so before I answer that question, I think you can't answer that question without actually looking at the history of the last 50, 60 years. You've got to go back to the 1979 Iranian Revolution. And you've got to look at the way that the Middle East and the wider region has evolved since that date and the role that the Iranian regime has played in that. And if you go back to the 80s when Iran was bogged down in a very bloody war against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and then you go through the 90s and the 2000s, and then you watch the way that after they came out of that long war, which had drained a lot of their resources, and particularly after the death of the original Ayatollah Khomeini back in '89, I think that you look at the way that Iran gradually began to expand its influence, gradually got its tentacles out into the region, and you will know this very well from your time in Lebanon. And they did it not through direct action or direct invasion. They did it through proxies. So they did it through Hezbollah in Lebanon, which a subject about which you know a lot. They did it through Hamas in Gaza after 2006, when Gaza was handed over to the Palestinians, not to Hamas, but to the Palestinians. They did it, of course, in Iraq with some of the Shia militia in the south of Iraq, and of course they did it in Yemen when they linked up with the Houthi, and they did it in Syria with Assad, in particular after 2013. And so, when I was in Baghdad, you were looking at an Iranian influence, a military influence. This is not a political influence. Let's be clear about this. This is a military influence. This is headed by the IRGC, and it was around the region. It was literally their tentacles were spreading right around the region, and there was genuine disquiet about this amongst the Arabs. Yeah, there's no question about that. And I remember talking about this a lot when I was in Baghdad. And for your listeners, I was in Baghdad from 2014 through 2017, and I spent most of the time I was there was spent fighting the war against Daesh. Um, but there was always this overriding concern around the Iranians, and particularly I think there was a concern, interestingly, also coming out of southern Iraq. Of course, you had the Iraqi militias that were under the financial control and the control of the Iranian IRGC. But there was a lot of concern amongst other Iraqi Shia, certainly coming out of Najaf, coming around the Shia element of Iraq that took a very different worldview to the hardline Iranian in Tehran. Now, in parallel with this, we shouldn't forget what's been going on internally in Iran. You've had a series over the years of uprisings against the government, all of which have been absolutely brutally suppressed, and particularly, of course, the Green Revolution, the revolution a few years ago amongst the Kurdish women, starting by the Kurdish women, but then the other Iranian women, and then, of course, most recently, just after Christmas, with the uprising begun by the students, but pretty much spreading to all facets Iranian society, which was brutally put down. And we can't let's not beat about the bush on this. You're talking independent observers talk about at least 35,000 people being killed, probably more. So we're talking about a particularly nasty regime here. Now, in parallel, of course, you have a situation where the Iranian regime was a genuine existential threat to Israel, and for decades have talked about essentially wiping Israel off the map. So you come to then let's fast forward and let's look at at what has happened over the last couple of years. Of course, you had the attack on the Iranian nuclear facilities last year, which was carried out by Israel with the United States. Concerns that Iran was about to develop a nuclear bomb. And again, we have to go back in history on this. A reality that under the Obama administration, the United States essentially did this nuclear deal with Iran. And I saw it, I can't remember who described it as this, but it was very well described by somebody who said that fundamentally what the nuclear deal was that the Iranians would claim dishonestly that they were not trying to develop a nuclear weapon, and the West would just agree with them. So it was there's no question that they were developing a nuclear weapon. There's no question about that. So that of course changes the balance of power in the region if they're successful in that, and of course is an existential threat to Israel. So then you move forward to what happened 2 or 3 weeks ago. Well, I think you've got to again look back and ask what are the rationale for what has happened. And I'm not saying whether I support this or not. I'm just trying to give an objective, intellectual assessment on what's actually happening, rather than getting tied up with, the emotional side of it. I think that if you look at the assessment from the Israeli side, obviously is that they're concerned about an existential threat. So they're going to do any advantage to hit the Iranians, and then the advantage of actually removing the supreme leader, killing the supreme leader, in their view, was too good a one to miss. Point in time, they'd had. I suspect they'd had the opportunity to do so previously, but that time. Of course, and that is on the back of them of having very successfully dismantled the Iranian stranglehold around them, having dismantled Hamas, because we shouldn't forget October the 7th. 2023. Nobody should ever forget that that's what started this. At the end of the day, that's what started this. The Hamas attack on Israel is what started all of this, and the response to that egregious, appalling, horrendous attack has seen the Iranian tentacles essentially cut off. The Hamas has been largely haven't been destroyed, but they've been defanged. Similarly with Hezbollah has been seriously weakened. Obviously, Syria, there's been a change of regime. So around the region, the Iranians have suffered a lot of tactical, in fact, strategic defeats. So for Israel, opportunity to attack a country that was an existential threat to it. For the United States, I think it's a bit more complicated. And I think that the problem we have, Dane, is that people tend to look at this these days. People look at this, they say, do we think this is right? And ultimately, it comes down to people's personal view on Trump. Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? If he's a good guy, we support him. If he's a bad guy, we don't support him. Well, I mean, that's it's so trite as to be ridiculous, but that is what happens a lot of the time. So let's look at the strategic approach, shall we? And I would argue.
Frank, I agree with you. I agree. Listen, it's a horrible regime, needed to change, needed to go away. After October 7th, which we shall never forget, I agree. Israel, I mean, they went in there, they took action against Hamas, Hezbollah, and all this. I agree with all that, and you know my feelings about Trump. But the reality is, what I want to understand is that, and I've on my show made it very clear numerous times, there needed to be regime change, absolute regime change, just like there needed to be regime change in Venezuela. But what I'm trying to get at is that what was the timing? 2 months ago, as you were talking about the protests that were happening in the streets, and Trump came out and said, take over the government offices, we'll be there for you. I really wish 2 months ago we had taken action to help those students in the streets. I really wish we had, because I think things might have been different. But if you look around the world now, let me just take this conversation in a little different direction. So first, let me say this. I agree there needed to be regime change. I agree that honestly, Iran was just being just kind of ignored in some ways that the world has not dealt with, especially under the Obama administration. I agree with you 100%. The Iranian deal was horrible, giving them back billions of dollars and saying, "Hey, we're going to trust you to do the right thing." Well, listen, it's like telling a pathological liar that you're going to trust them. It's just not going to happen. But if you look at now and where we are in the war, let me ask you the question a different way. Do you think the war was executed in the correct way? I mean, let's say we agree that there needed to be regime change, but was the war executed in the right way? And do you think that there will be regime change? And is that victory? I mean, let me ask another question. Do you think victory for America and Israel is regime change? And if there's not regime change, is it still victory?
Let's, I was going to come on to this point. I mean, I generally speaking, I think regime change is extremely, extremely hard. It's an extremely difficult issue. It sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you change the regime, sometimes you don't. But before we get on to that, I think we need to look more carefully at what is here, what the strategic objectives are. Now, I think with Israel, it's regime change, but if it's not, if they can't get regime change, then it's to neuter the threat to Israel, the military threat to Israel. With the United States, I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that that necessarily was the original strategic objective. And then again, when you talk about the United States, I think you're talking about the president, and no one else except maybe Marco Rubio. I don't know, but I would have thought. It seems to me that actually you can argue the strategic approach a different way, and it may be nothing to do with regime change. I don't know, but I'm just going to put out there an alternative theory because that's what I do. I look at the theories. The alternative theory is that the biggest, as far as the president is concerned, the biggest threat to the United States is China. And how do you deal with a problem like China? I mean, first of all, let's look at the way the president operates. What he tends to do is he tends to push, and then try and come up with some kind of deal. We know that. That's what he's done for the first 4 years of his term, less successfully then because he wasn't really ready for it. But this time, that's what he's done. So how do you get China genuinely to the negotiating table? You cut off their oil because oil is what runs China. That's the key factor for the Chinese economy is oil. So who are the biggest suppliers of oil to China? Number one, you just mentioned it, Venezuela. Number two, Iran. Number two, Iran. So what do? You go in and you disrupt those suppliers. And I'm not saying this is what he was thinking. I'm just saying this is a possibility. So, because I had no idea what he's thinking. So you go into Venezuela very successfully, very quickly. You do the operation. You get what is ultimately a more pliant ally or whatever. And then after that, because that's gone so well, you think you do the same with Iran. So you go in, you think if I cut off maybe regime change in Iran, or at least let's do something that will seriously disrupt the oil, and that brings the Chinese to the negotiating table. So there is potentially a strategy there that is nothing to do ultimately with genuine regime change. Because in a sense, in Venezuela, you haven't had real regime change. You've just had movement from one to another. So that's one way I think of looking at it. Because I think if it was genuinely about regime change, I agree with you. Then it would have happened a month ago when everybody was out. It's before 30, 35, probably many, many more, to be honest with you. Let's certainly before tens of thousands of innocent protesters lost their lives or were murdered.
Well, listen, your theory, I agree with your theory. And China and Russia are the two greatest threats in the world, in my opinion. We've let Russia off the hook. We can talk about that later. But China, I agree. And this is, you're spot on. You're 100% correct that the world needs to understand that China operates. I mean, they're one of the world's greatest economies because they have the power infrastructure to do that, which means they need oil. They need to feed the beast. And if you cut off oil, then it's hard to feed the beast. And so, no, I agree. I think that if that is why the president is doing what he's doing, then I'm 100% on board on it. I mean, I really am. One thing that the president is not very good at is articulating this to the American public. But I will say that there's certain things, as we know, that the president can't and shouldn't articulate to the American public. But let's say that you're right about that. I mean, I found it interesting, the fact that he invited the Chinese to send warships to open up the Strait of Hormuz. Maybe that was just some kind of cover. I'm not really sure. I'm sure the Chinese won't. But I think that if you want to rein in China, attacking Iran, going after Venezuela are two great ways to do it. I also think that the other ripple effect of this is going to be the impact on Russia, because it's going to make it very difficult for them to get the Shahed drones and the ballistic missiles. But we have like 3 minutes here, yes, 2 minutes left. So I want to ask you this. Let's switch to the UK real quick. So let's say all this is happening. What the heck is going on with Keir Starmer and this war? I mean, what he seems to go back and forth, change constantly. Where do you think the UK is on this, and do you agree with what's happening?
The UK is on it, Dane. Look, Keir Starmer, so far as I can make out, I don't know Keir Starmer, but so far as I can make out, he takes a completely international legalistic view about everything, absolutely everything. And the legal advice he got was that this was an illegal attack because it hadn't been but we haven't got time to go into the rationale, but that's what he was told. That's what he believes. Now, whether that's the case or not, I don't know. I'm not a lawyer, but bottom line is that's why he takes an overly legalistic approach to everything, and nothing else seems really to resonate with him. So all he has done throughout this conflict, it seems to me, is to leap from one legal position to another, which has largely consisted of sitting on the fence. Now, I have my own personal views about whether that's right or wrong, but I think that's to understand what has been going on in the UK. That's you fundamentally got to understand that. I think he's also got a cabinet that is deeply split on this. I think there are members of the British cabinet who would support the United States. There are more vocal members of the British cabinet who do not want to support the United States for any reason. And we come back to the point about not because it's the United States, but because it's Donald Trump. And so I think that seems to me to be the reason behind what has been, I think, a very uncharacteristic response of sitting on the fence from the United Kingdom.
No, I think you're right. I think a lot of what the world leaders are doing and their response to Trump's outreach is the fact that they're basing it on their personal opinions about President Trump versus about what's best. Because on one hand, war doesn't bother me. I think war is fine. It's a great way to. It's not a great way. It's a way to settle conflict. I believe in regime change. I believe that we need to go after, once again, you talk about Iran being an existential threat. Yes, when you have any country in the world saying that we want to destroy another country, we're blatant about that. I mean, no, they have to be reined in. I agree with you 100%. But, this is just proof that, we don't have the global community working together like it should. And you're spot on again about the fact that I think it boils down to personality issues and not what's necessarily right. And that's just, sometimes we need to put our differences and our opinions aside and do that. Real quick, we got 30 seconds here, Frank. So what do you think? How long do you think this war is going to last?
I don't think anybody really knows. I think it just depends ultimately, it depends on the president. I think it's in his hands. He can decide to walk away and claim victory. He can decide to carry on. He can put boots on the ground. I mean, who knows? We just don't know, Dave. I think it's extremely unlikely that latter point, by the way. But we can't rule anything out. We just don't know. I think it's going to be months rather than weeks, personally. But we really don't know.
Listen, I really appreciate it. And I think again, it's important your thoughts about the justification for this war, about taking on China. I think these are the conversations we need to have. Once again, you're right that the whole world is looking at this and talking about, hey, it's about Trump, making it a personal issue. But if you look at the larger strategic issue about what the threats are in the world, Russia and China, I think this is a good way to try to rein China in. And I appreciate you bringing it up. But listen, Frank, once again, thanks for being on here. Go back and enjoy life. It's always great seeing you, and I look forward to seeing you in person again soon. So I'll talk to you again soon.